You have learned what is CSS and what are its type. But how will you come to know what to put in that CSS? Now we will learn CSS properties. So what are CSS property? CSS properties are used to style your HTML elements. A CSS property declaration consists of a property name and a property value. If you specify more than one CSS property, the each name value pair is separated by a semicolon. There are many CSS properties which are applied to almost every HTML elements, and there are some special CSS properties which can be applied to only specific HTML elements. We are going to use internal CSS so styling code remains in front of your eyes. Let's comment this external CSS reference. We will try to cover all the important CSS property one by one. The first one is background properties. In background properties we can define the background color using background color following your color. Let's create a div and apply background color to it. We can also use image as background using background image. See, the background image is repeated, so here we can use background repeat no repeat. You can play with other properties to expand your CSS knowledge. Now the image is not covering the whole size of the div, so we can use background size cover so that it covers the whole div, but the image will be cropped. The contain value will try to contain the image in the div with keeping the aspect ratio of the image. You can also set the initial position of the background image using background position and value that is left, right, center, etc. of your choice. Next property is border. An HTML element can have a border around it. Borders can be solid, dashed, three-dimensional, have rounded corners, and you can even use images in your borders. Let's remove the background image first. To set a border, use border property which takes three value: border width, border style, border color. The first value defines the width of the border, the second value defines that border style should be solid. There are more border style which I am going to display on the screen. And the third value is the color of your border. You can define each border property individually like this. You can also define the style of the border of top, bottom, left and right of an HTML element individually. Or you can define it individually like this. The next border property is border radius. The border radius CSS property is used to create rounded corners of borders on HTML elements. As you can see, the div element now has rounded corners. We can also set the border radius of each corner of HTML element like this. The next property is colors. There are several CSS properties which specify colors for parts of HTML elements. For instance, color, background color, border color, etc. There are a number of ways you can define color in CSS. The first one is predefined color code. These predefined color codes may seem handy, they rarely meet your needs. The next one is hexadecimal RGB. When you specify a hexadecimal RGB color, you write the red, green, and blue color values in hexadecimal numbers. Next one is RGB colors. The RGB color format is very similar to the hexadecimal color format. Each color is specified as a mix between red, green and blue. You use decimal numbers between 0 and 255 for defining the color. Next is RGBA. RGBA colors mean red, green, blue, and alpha. The RGB part is the same as in RGB colors. The A specifies the opacity of the color. That's all for colors property. The next CSS property is font. Font plays an important role in displaying the content on your web page. The font family, the font size and the font color should be such that user don't find it difficult to read the content displayed. So let's dive into font property. The first property is font family. The font family CSS property is used to specify the font used by an HTML element containing text. You can also use custom fonts using font face property. To define your custom font, you should have the font file like mine. Declare the font family for your new font like this. In the URL of the source, provide the location of your font file. That's it. You can also import font online. Google Fonts is the best example. Let's see how. Search uFont. Click on Select this style. Then click in Embed tab. If want to link the font, then use the link content. Paste the link in the head of your HTML page. Now you can use the font simply like this. If you want to import, then click on Import and copy the content and paste it in the head of your HTML page. If you are using external CSS, copy only the import part and paste it on the first line of your CSS file. The next property in font is font size. The font size CSS property sets the size of the rendered text. There are many units for font size such as pixel, percentage, which is relative to its parent, VW which is viewport width, and last is VH which is viewport height. The VW and VH adjust the font size according to the width of the browser. There are many other units, but these are important. We will be using VW as a unit in the future of our course. Font weight is the next CSS property. The font weight CSS property sets the thickness of text rendered inside an HTML element. The values which can be defined in font weight are shown on the screen. Normal is the default value. Most often only the bold value is used. As I have said earlier, there are some special properties for some HTML elements. UL and OL element are one of them. In UL and OL element, list style type CSS property controls the bullets used by the UL element, and the numbering used by the OL element. For the UL element you can use disk, circle, square, and none values. Let's see an example. None value will remove the list style type. The valid values for the list style type property for OL elements are displayed on the screen. Let's change the unordered list to ordered list. The next CSS property is margin. But first, what is margin? Used to define the space around elements. We can control the margin using the margin property of CSS. Let's delete all listing code and add a text in the div. This will set the margin on all four sides of the HTML element. This is the shorthand property to set all the margin property in one line. This will set the margin top to 20 pixels, margin right to 10 pixels, margin bottom to 20 pixels and margin left to 10 pixels. You can also set the margin value individually like this. The next CSS property is padding. An element's padding is the space between its content and its border. The padding CSS property values are specified in the same way as margins. Using the shorthand property. This will sets the padding on all four sides of the HTML element and its border. If you notice that when we apply the padding, the height and width of the div gets bigger than 500 pixel, which we don't want as it may lead to unresponsive behavior. To remove this behavior we need to use box sizing property of CSS property. You can change how the browsers calculate the size of the HTML element with the box sizing CSS property. Box sizing takes three values: content box, border box, and inherit. We will learn only border box as it is more important and useful. Let's learn this with an example. Let's declare one more div with a class having same properties as the first one. Now both the div have same property. Let's apply padding to one div. In the output you will see the width and height of the div in which applied the padding is changed. In reality we want the first div to be the same size as of second div even after applying the padding. Let's apply border box to the first div. Great. Now let's apply the border box to the second div also. You will see its size also changes. What really happens here when we apply padding here is shown on your screen. Without border box the browser calculates the width and height of div like this. With border box the browser calculates the width and height of div like this. Always use the box sizing border box in your universal selector so that you don't have repeated for every other div or HTML element. Coming back to padding. You can also set the padding value individually like this. That's all for padding. The next CSS property is float. It specifies how HTML element should float in web page. The value for float are left and right. Let's see an example. Set the first div to float left and the second div to float right. Nice. The problem arises when we add the third div with some content. Look, it is not visible but it is rendered in the web page but hiding behind the first div. This will happen every time you add a new HTML element. So to remove this issue we should use clear CSS property. This property can only be used if float is defined in a web page. Always set the value to both. This will remove the issue we were facing. As we are not going to cover animation in this crash course, so I am not covering the CSS properties for animation. That's all were the important CSS properties. If I missed something then please comment.